So now it's time for the third expert panel of the day, which will be deliberating on the topic towards a critical view of the digital economy. So yeah, now it's time for the third expert panel of the day, which will be deliberating on the topic towards a critical view of the digital economy. So for this, I would like to invite all the panelists on stage. Dr. Aakansha Natani, Assistant Professor, IIIT Hyderabad. Dr. Anupam Guha, Assistant Professor, Ashank, Desai Center for Policy Studies, IIT Bombay. Dr. Rahul Sapkal, Assistant Professor, Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies, IIT Bombay. Okay. Dr. Shishir, Professor, Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies, IIT Bombay. The discussion aims to provide a critical view of both the structures and the practices that have been embraced by the digital industry at large, while throwing considerable light on the ground level tensions that policymakers will need to negotiate in the near future. I would like to request Dr. Aakansha Natani to kindly moderate the session.
Okay. So I welcome you all for this third session of Public Policy Dialogues at ISB Hyderabad, that is towards a critical view of the digital economy. I first of all welcome all the panelists here. And I would like to start with the question that why do we even need to talk about this? That there has to be some discussions around public policy in the digital economy now. Well, you would have noticed that everything around us has changed with computers and internet. You know, earlier you were watching IPL matches, you will see advertisements of, let's say, one hero jumping from mountains to get a soft drink bottle because it's summers now, or, you know, fairness cream, or some shampoo, or some oil. Now, if you would have noticed, all of the advertisements are download this app and then download this app, right? So things have changed very rapidly, and that is why it is very, very important that the nuances within the public policy are noticed, and, you know, some kind of, you know, recommendations are given, some kind of, you know, new policies are introduced, and that is where, you know, this panel will be very important in highlighting about what is happening in this digital economy. And at the same time, we should not forget that we are the largest democracy of the world, which means we are going to be the largest digital democracy of the world as well. So we need to consider the questions of the people's rights, liberty, equality, justice, and all of that within this digital economy. Telecom Regulatory Authority of India recently released a data saying that there are 1140 million mobile users in India, and out of which like 650 million are internet users. So it's a big space, and there's a big scope for public policy intervention here. We have Professor Shishir from IIT Bombay, Center for Policy Studies. He will be talking about the role of venture capital funding in this digital economy, that whatever service we are getting on just one click with our phone, what kind of system is working backhand, and how these, you know, digital startups, if I call them, are able to sustain. So I would like to ask Professor Shishir to take the mic.
Okay, good afternoon. For some of you who might be intrigued by the name Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies, so if I like to just plug that this is a recent center, independent center that has come up at IIT Bombay, and we three faculty are there, myself, Shishir, Professor Anupam, Professor Rahul, and including a few others. We are very keen in examining. Particularly, today will be an attempt at doing that, particularly examining the structural sort of elements that go into the digital economy, right, from various different perspectives. So I'd like to thank ISB and Bharati School for allowing this opportunity to to present some of our ongoing work. When I was thinking of trying to put together this panel, basically the thoughts that we sort of exchanged between us was that, I wanted to do something which was, and I'll talk about that in a minute, or do something which has not really been examined closely in the Indian context, perhaps also globally, which is looking at, as Dr. Aakansha was saying, looking at the role of venture capitalists, right? And my other colleagues will, talk about labor and particularly about precarity, but also labor in the sense of Taylorism and how they're, coming together. So let me begin. These are some questions that I'm going to sort of try and examine. I may not be able to really do it. At least the first two, I'll try to do that in the 15 minutes. So basically, there is something rather unprecedented in the history of global capitalism, right? The rise of, and I'm arguing the rise of this digital economy, right? In the last 3 decades, post-90s, you've got a set of firms, you've got the ecosystem that has been created, which is unprecedented. When I say unprecedented, I mean the steep rise, right? The swift rise, the rise at scale. Right. A Facebook can claim that it has perhaps more than, close to 4 billion people who are on that platform. Right? No other, seemingly other sort of, if you want to say, elements of the previous set of industries, right? Which obviously this room is being lit up by power, by electricity, but it took time to reach the furthest corners of the globe. The digital economy, something very interesting is happening, and as students, if you will, as students of public policy, it is incumbent on us to examine this even more closely because of the power that the digital economy exudes, right? So what has enabled the historically most unprecedented rise of the digital platform economy, right? And what in particular is the role of venture capital in this rapid emergence? These are the first 2 questions that I'm going to really try and examine. And then subsequently, what in the way has been an industrial bargain between venture capitalists and digital firms. I'll give some hints at that, and then further on, something that I'm working on is to look at, for instance, how is this being negotiated, right? So I'm going to go through the earlier slides a little more quickly because I think most of us are well acquainted with the kind of underpinnings of the digital economy. But for the sake of argument, for the sake of being on the same page, if you will, the digital economy is both, I would just to define it, is both the effective acquisition, dissemination, use, and the virtual mobilization of data to create economic value. Right? So you can define this in various different ways, but this is one way that I found useful. And digital transactions, as Dr. Aakansha said, and we know, are really entrenching themselves in every section of the economy, right? Whether it's IPL or whether it is, simple COVID time, right? Most of our transactions, the fact that UPI succeeded so well beyond the wildest dreams of even the policymakers is something that tells us about the sort of, the deep entrenchment of this economy. It covers very large swaths of social and economic interactions on a global scale. And the digital technologies, platforms, and data are playing an increasingly significant role in governance. Right? Just one example is smart cities. Right? So we have technologies that are often, interestingly, black boxed. And when I say black boxed, I mean particularly very rigid standards, high design, centralized control. Right? So what we see is a particular kind of configuration emerging in the digital economy, particularly the roles of social media, roles of very private enterprises. This is what I'm going to try and examine briefly. Okay. So when we say, typically when I say platform economy, there's something rather amazingly enthralling about this experience, right? Exuberant, right? In the sense that the ease with which we are able to open up apps, open up a Uber app. Last night I went, with a colleague of mine, we went out, right? It just took a few minutes to be able to get an app. The seamless integration of finance, right? The disruptions that are happening, all across, right? These are just a few of the elements that have been seamlessly being integrated, and those of us who feel very excited about it, it mostly is a wonderful user experience, right? But what's happening at the back end, right? What's happening in terms of how has this actually been created? What's the politics of that? What's the policy of that, right? That's something I feel we don't examine as closely, and I think as public policy scholars, public policy students, we should do that. So, just a couple more slides, and then I'm going to talk more about the venture capitalists. Government support has been very critical for the rise of the digital economy. One act that actually is sort of significant in the way that it's used and has been mentioned is the Semiconductor Act 1984. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it allowed for a huge scale microelectronic revolution, right? So allowed for sensors, routers, integrated circuits, all of those things to be rapidly built up, right? If you've got 4 billion people logged in onto your account, obviously the data of 4 billion people is being extracted, well, arguably every day. Where do you hold that? How do you sort of process that, right? So you need that back-end support, right? So the Semiconductor Act is a very interesting act. As I said, we don't have time, which was sort of, deliberately inserted, right? Deliberately sort of legislated by US to be able to create the early sort of generation of these products. There's also the ubiquitous digital presence on the other end, right? If the supply side is being sort of shaped by government policies, on the other end you have a ubiquitous, which I mentioned early on, a ubiquitous digital presence, right? The raw materials of this economy, right? Benkler has said the raw materials of the economy is existing information culture, with an actual marginal social cost as close to zero. No other industry in the history of capitalism I know has, can claim that the actual marginal cost is close to zero, right? That you can endlessly reproduce some of this data. So, we have a rise on top of this digital economy of platformization, right? Multiple tethered devices, right? And I've skipped that slide, but I want to just show you, for instance, something rather interesting and amazing. The first time I saw this table, this is the cash reserves, if you will, onshore and offshore of some of these well-known companies, right? And it's interesting, one always keeps on asking the question how and why until you reach that bedrock assumption where, at least at that time, you're not able to answer that question further, right? How is it possible? Right, that you're able to acquire and have this cash flow? What is it being used for? Right? Is it remaining idle? Right. So what really, is venture capital? Equity-backed funding, investment in business that are high risk and hold a stake in the business, usually. Widely used by tech startups, even by others, but recently in the last 2 decades, for whom conventional funding is typically unavailable. Right. It plays various other signaling functions apart from funding, also plays a role in determining a startup business model. I'll come to that in a minute. The role and influence of VCs in shaping access to digital economy is what is really under-examined. Here is an interesting quote, which I'll just read out briefly by Omara. It says, traditional banks, or for that matter, most investors, were unwilling to give it meaning the loans, to young men, yes, mostly they were young men, who'd never worked outside an academic lab, and who often were building products for which there wasn't yet a market. Startup founders required investors who understood the technology they were building, but also knew how to navigate the business world. And they needed someone who was a little bit of a gambler. They needed a venture capitalist, right? So your traditional banking structure could not play this role. Right? So this is a very crucial element of understanding the rise of both venture capitalists and digital firms. The roles of VC in digital capitalism is, according to some literature, is fivefold. I'll just briefly mention on the financing, selection, and signaling. Right? Financing is obviously the most critical of the functions. It basically pushes firms to become financially viable and profitable. Financing of other entities in network, like law firms and consulting firms. So if you get funding from a large venture capitalist, that it signals to the market that, well, this firm is capable of getting attention from law firms, consulting firms, etc. Right? Zuboff says there is also, interestingly, it seems like a paradox, but a calculated sense of impatient money, looking for returns, quick returns, high returns. Right. So that is the doggedness with which VCs sort of pursue firms, right, when they invest in these firms. Early funded firms usually manage to raise money in subsequent funding, right? So VC financing, I've just got some table. This can be expanded considerably. You can see, for instance, the amounts, right, which in CDs have always increased by leaps and bounds. But almost every single large entity you can think of, VC firm, you'll find, right, there is, a good cousin behind, right, somebody who's helped them, right. Top investors in the current billion-dollar club, right. So, selection function and signaling function, but let me get, because we don't have considerable time. How am I doing with time? Is that 2? Oh, okay. So just to give you one example, Clearview, right? Clearview is an interesting firm which uses facial recognition technology for law enforcement, right? In India, so far, FRT is not yet legislated, but we are using it in India. Right, it's interesting. We should ask these questions of our policymakers. Why is it being used, perhaps? But billions of images were literally scraped from law enforcement databases, internet and social media sites without really one's permission, right? From Facebook, LinkedIn. Used by more than 600 law enforcement agencies in the US, and it's almost a blanket surveillance scheme, right? Financed by various VCs, but not all have been made public. So VCs, interestingly, appear to be largely agnostic. Right? This is something, I'd love to hear your concerns also about. Are largely agnostic to legal and ethical concerns, as long as it seems, and there are examples, right? Examples of Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes. There's a interesting documentary about Theranos on Netflix, if you're interested. The WeWorks, which is also collapsed, right? Elizabeth had a personal worth of $4.5 billion at the age of 30, right? And there were several blue chip companies, right? You would really be skeptical. Why did these blue chip companies actually invest in companies like WeWorks, Theranos, etc.? So Clearview also, in its own way, raised about $8.6 million. So the technology is marketed for law enforcement, as I've already mentioned. Right. So what is, interestingly, the point that I'm trying to sort of belabor here is that VCs have played, how should one say, sort of a very significant role, an unprecedented role, unparalleled role in the rise of a particular sector, the digital economy. And this digital economy, in some ways, one is arguing, I'm arguing, is having an unprecedented influence on our lives. Right? Even during, years and years of loss, you have VCs supporting these firms, right? So I think, just as one important initial premise, is that one should begin to investigate even more closely. There is this, early romanticism that yes, startups do get support from VCs, but an enduring support over decades is something that I'm trying to, through my own work, and I'm just giving you a brief view of that. I'm trying to examine how deeply sort of, entrenched is this role of VCs, right? I know I'm done with my time. Just one or two more slides and I'll close. So VCs have deeply influenced business models of firms. Right, you'll see low predatory pricing initially, market capture, then consolidating of network effects at scale. Right, this has happened time and time again. Non-performing firms or firms in red may still be in cash rich, as I showed you a table earlier, and have high valuations. Acquisitions are going through the roof, not in the COVID years, but certainly Alphabet, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, acquired about 400 firms in a period of 10 years. Right. So conclusion for the research, VCs have, as I've said, played a significant role This has had considerable influence on public policy in the digital realm. We need really, that's what the call is, for instance, need for a critical and historical analysis of the role of VCs and need better understanding of who the actors are and various roles they have played. Sorry for the rush, but I hope I've just made a very basic point. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Shishir. And as I said, that everything that is happening in the digital economy has a lot of scope for public policy, like what kind of negotiations or industrial bargain that are taking place between these venture capital firms and these new startups, digital firms. So that's very important. We have Professor Anupam Guha with us, who will be talking about very interesting topic, that is Taylorism and the nature of platform work in digital economy. So in the industrial society, they came up with this model of scientific worker management, that how do you give good training and good workplace, and then you give them good incentives so that you can get a machine-like production from a human being. But now you have Swiggy, where people are working, and they are not the employees of Swiggy, they are the partners, they are the delivery partners. So basically you don't get any employee benefit. So that definitely is a very important, crucial area, and we have Professor Anupam Guha who will talk about it.
Thanks, Professor Jha, for that excellent talk and setting a bit of context which will help me finish mine in time. Taylorism and the nature of platform work in the digital economy. For those, most of you would know the context, but for those of you who do not know, Taylorism was this idea by Frederick Taylor, early 20th century, that it is possible to manage a workplace in a scientific manner, observe the worker minutely, and hence get the maximum amount of value from the worker. This definition itself of Taylorism needs to be interrogated, especially in the context of the digital economy. And there are a lot of new interesting problems which have cropped up, and we'll be talking about that. First of all, there is a common concept we all are aware of, but we cannot seem to define, and that is the platform. Like, the platform exists. Everybody knows that platforms are a dominant force in modern capitalism, but what exactly is a platform? If you hear platforms define themselves, they call themselves a kind of a market, a place where some people are providing services, some people are buying those services, and the job of the platform is to facilitate that negotiation. I would like to contend that that way of thinking about platforms is fundamentally wrong, and not just wrong, it is in a sense obscuring what platforms really are. And the case I am trying to make is that platforms are factories, not markets. Why? First of all, what is a factory, right? You must be knowing what is a factory. You might have seen a factory in your life, perhaps, but a factory is not merely a building with a chimney stack on top of it where things are made inside. Any venue where people are gathered together to work and overseen is called a factory. The factory form did not come out of magic. It did not happen that somewhere in the industrial era, when industrialization was becoming a thing, somebody woke up and thought, you know what, we should gather all these people together in a building and we should have them work. In fact, people used to work in their homes in small workshops all the time. The capitalists used to distribute money to workers who used to work in their own house with tools, create the cloth, generally it was cloth making in Manchester, and give the cloth back to the capitalist. The official story is that when you gather people in a building and make them work, it is more efficient. That is the official story. The story of division of labor, that when you have a bunch of people each doing specific things overseen by overseers in a building, it's efficient. That official story is also wrong. Economic historians would tell you that what actually a factory did was surveillance. It wasn't so much that division of labor is something that creates efficiency. What actually happens is that once you have a bunch of people working under your gaze of your overseers, it is possible to squeeze them a little harder. And it's also possible to make certain that they are not doing anything else aside from working, right? So this idea of, is the worker on the factory floor lazing around, and with your foreman you ensure they are not lazing around. Now interestingly, and this argument is, I believe, first made by a postdoctoral scholar in Germany, Dr. Moritz Solternid. He identified something very interesting. He saw that pretty much every platform works analogously. The platform decides the money which and I'm going to use the word very deliberately, the employee makes, while claiming they are not employees. It is not the customer which decides that. The platform surveils the employee to make certain that the employee works. Take Uber, for example, where you take the customer from, where you drop off the customer, how you drove, all of those things are measured. The platform is engaging in every single Taylorist practice. Taylorism has three components. You surveil the person, you make mathematical judgments about how they work, and you try to modify their behavior to extract the most amount of value from them. Platforms do all of these three things. And hence, a platform is not a market, it's a factory. And the factory itself is the app which is on the phone. Now, interestingly, when we come to these factories are not possible without artificial intelligence. There is not a single platform which can operate at scale without machine learning going through a lot of data in order to make decisions about certain things the platform does, whether it be revenue related or decision making as navigation in case of ride share and Zomato like apps, or in case of Amazon price, etc. Artificial intelligence is fundamental to the running of platforms, but artificial intelligence is not creating value out of magic. The data which feeds artificial intelligence is also a product of micro labor of millions of people. Whether or not considered labor, whether or not paid, is a different question. So interestingly, platforms cannot exist without machine learning, but the machine learning industry, that is the AI industry, which requires a lot of data to keep doing its research and deployment, cannot exist without platform. It's a very interesting dialectical relationship which needs to be scientifically examined. And hence, platformization as a phenomenon, not just platform. With the rise of collection of vast amounts of data, and with the rise of machine learning as an industry, you will inevitably create platforms, and the creation of these platforms will enable machine learning and will also change how work is done in places which are not platforms, by which I mean blue collar and white collar traditional employment. Throughout the history of factories existing, whether those be the chimney stack factories of the 19th century or the, the very sleek and modern factories which lie in your cell phone, the primary driver of workplace management has been a certain almost, a disease of sorts, this anxiety of time theft. If you look at the original writings of Frederick Taylor, the whole idea behind scientific management was that workers have sold their time to us, and in that time they must produce. This is very interesting, because this means that when you sit for your salary negotiation, if you are going to be an employee somewhere, you are not actually selling your labor, as in you are not selling this idea that I will do certain labor to create certain products. No, you are selling your time, and within that time, as much as labor is possible will be extracted from you. This is common throughout all employment, even those employments where you actually produce stuff for payment like freelancing and not give your time, because the price of that stuff is also back calculated from the time that you spend on it. Christy Ball, in her seminal paper, examines modern workplace practices which are analogous. She calls it workplace surveillance. And there's a very interesting kind of surveillance because, yes, it is surveillance, but no state on the planet, no government on the planet considers it surveillance. Like if you look at the DPDP bill, which is not yet a law, which has everything for like privacy, this, that, but it has that phrase in it that if an employer collects data for measuring the performance of their employee, that is not covered under the bill. And there are analogous escape routes in pretty much all data regimes, which is again very interesting because performance of employee could mean anything. If you are my employee, I could make a case that your performance deteriorates if you go to a restaurant after work. So I want to know where you are even after work. I want to have your phone's location. And no, this is not a rhetorical case I am making. This actually happened with sanitation workers in Panchkula. I'll be talking about that later. So if when it comes to measuring performance of work, it gives you a sort of license for mass surveillance, but yet to not call it surveillance. And that is something, again, vital to study when we are talking of the digital economy. How about India? What's the situation here? This sort of stuff started in the 2000s when we had BPOs and call centers. And the very first thing we see when these things start is this idea that you can measure and by scientifically data-driven management, etc. Of course, none of it is scientific. It is pseudoscience of the worst nature, but that's how it was called. And why do I call it pseudoscience? Because it first suffers from something called precision bias. Precision bias is this idea that you can measure truth always. But if your definition of truth is wrong, then your precision is not the same as accuracy. So you conflate precision for accuracy and you get very high numbers on your metric, but your metrics don't translate to any real world truth value. This is also called benchmark bias. This idea that benchmarks are a representation of truth. Mostly they are not, and sometimes they are snake oil, like emotion detection, the biggest snake oil industry that exists right now. Billions of dollars worth of industry. I am an AI scientist. I am telling you with quite responsibility, it is fake. Emotion detection is about as scientific as astrology. In fact, I would say that astrology is a little more scientific than emotion detection. Continuing. When we had these call centers, first we had metrics, then we had conversion of metrics into digitization, and then we had this very interesting idea of multi-surveillance. This idea that, surveillance by itself is not bad if everybody is doing it. So let the employee also survey the manager, and let the offshore customer surveil the manager and the employee, and everybody is surveilling each other, because what is that statement? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. I have never heard a more nonsense statement when it comes to workplace management, but it is something that has been going on. And this leads to this clean IT sector idea, this idea that factories were where exploitation happened. The IT sector, on the other hand, is clean and hence should not be regulated. It is like, in a sense, sterile. And in many senses, employees also share this incorrect idea of how work happens. Machine learning, if you look at the earliest papers of usage of machine learning in a workplace, they start with something very harmless, things like attendance, etc. But then they go on, and in 2012 we have the GPU boom, and we also have Carpethy et al.'s famous paper. ImageNet comes, which is this data set made by Dr. Lee Feifei of California, and we suddenly have FRT at workplaces, and platforms are incorporating these practices. How much time do I have?
2 minutes max.
2 minutes, right? So these are things, like Professor Jha said, there is no law in India which regulates these things which look at your face and identify you and surveil you, and sometimes they don't even work. Like there was this interesting paper by Nayantara Ranganathan about garment workers where the cameras were actually not connected to anything, but mere presence of camera was enough to let the overseers sort of harass workers and prevent unionization, etc., etc. More issues. COVID-19 led to a side issue, which was a dilution of the labor laws, but that was sort of a boon for these companies. Like the only industry which made money in COVID was the IT sector, because work from home became a thing, and enabling work from home using performance metric software became a big business. And like I said, then it goes into pseudoscience territory, like emotion recognition. There are companies, there is one company whose name I will take, Metal. It claims that it can tell you which of your employees are narcissistic and have dark personality, and all woo-woo. It is all astrology. It doesn't work. Okay, if you want to debate me scientifically as to why I'm calling it astrology, hokum, horseshit, we can talk later. Productivity, no empirical evidence. That is what this slide says. There is no empirical evidence. On the other hand, there is empirical evidence that constant surveillance of employees leads to a downturn in productivity. There are also economics paper which says that at a macro level, when you invest capital instead of productive capital, if you invest money in surveillance capital, it stops giving returns after a while, and the returns it is giving is not because productivity is increasing. The returns it is giving is because you are suppressing labor power, like you are suppressing unionization, you are decreasing wages. That's why the so-called productivity is increasing. Actually, it's not productivity. So there is structural evidence that wage depression happens. There is also evidence that as platformization increases, women are thrown out of the industry. Simple reason, because because work is now no longer work, hence work benefits are not a thing. Women inside patriarchy have to work at home without wages, so they don't have time. So without structured work, they are not able to work, so they choose not to work. And finally, refies and amplifies brutal caste practices. So we saw this with sanitation workers in Panchkula. They were wearing biometrics, and the interesting thing about the voice and the video recording of those biometrics was that they were asked to go home and recharge those sensors. So they were in a sense taking part in their own surveillance. And when researchers approached the municipality where this was happening and asked them, where is the data being stored? What are the privacy practices? Municipality was, we don't have an idea. Then they said, okay, but you are running the system. They were like, oh yes, we outsourced it to a company in Kuwait, I believe, and they are taking care of everything. So at the end of the day, nobody knew what was happening, but there was widespread mass surveillance of these blue-collar workers happening. This is, I believe, the last slide. So 1 minute. This is not merely, like if we boil it down to a policy problem, this is not merely a question of a better data protection. It isn't. Because at the end of the day, you will end up playing machine learning whack-a-mole with every single machine learning use case which comes up, if all you are going to look at is how data is being protected. The end impact of the particular use case is where you can draw bright red lines. If platform work is work, then you are going to invoke labor laws, and you are going to expand the definition of surveillance from the surveillance in public space to surveillance in workspaces, which are arguably private spaces, and surveillance through private apps. Scientifically, the idea of this being an issue between productivity and data privacy is a false binary, and the only way to cut through this false binary is by two things. First, you recognize that people who work on platforms are actually workers, and then you enforce labor rights on them. One final paper which I would mention you, so I gave you a sort of a political economy analysis, but if you want a legal scholarship analysis, there is Dr. Julia Tomasetti. She's a professor at Hong Kong, I believe, and she wrote this paper. She went through the EULA agreement of Uber drivers, and through studying that contract, she makes a case that this is not a contract between service providers and customers. This is akin to a factory contract. It's just like if you replace certain words by other words, it's like an employment contract which doesn't recognize that it is an employment contract. On that note, I finish my talk. Hopefully, I have given you something to think about.
Thank you, Professor Anupam, for really important insights. As I told you, the world is changing and the question of data protection is coming into existence. With that, the question of data ownership and then data distribution is also coming into existence. That's where the role of public policy comes in. We have our third presenter, Professor Rahul Sapkal, who will be talking about the labor and emerging precarity in the digital economy, because we have a history in 20th century of a lot of labor rights that are given, for example, maximum working hours, minimum wages, maternity leaves, prevention of sexual harassment at workplaces and all of that. How would that work in the digital workplaces, and what kind of contradictions that are emerging that are kind of we need to be examined from the public policy perspective? So that's also a very important paper. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. At the beginning, I would like to thank ISB, BIPP for this wonderful opportunity to come here and present some of the ongoing work that is I'm doing with the government of India, also with the National Human Rights Commissions, and to show some of the lights that is happening here. But I really like the way the panel has been actually conducted. The Professor Jha actually talked about how the emergence of a digital economy in the gaze of a venture capitalist providing input to this industry. Like Anupam has actually elaborated about what is happening actually inside the factory and how the technology embedded like a production system is actually controlling the worker and the workplace. I would like to go beyond the factory and that how it is implications, the way the industry is reconfigured and how it has really impacting the lives of a worker. So there I would like to ask some questions, the questions that the government is grappling through the policy with the various labor laws and how the work is actually facing. So I would like to put that question that I will end my talk here. So let's go and just contextualize the debate. I know, as we know that in 2022, on the technological frontier, India has ranked 43 out of 180 countries, and the jump has been really swift. It means that, okay, the access to technology and the technological embeddedness has actually increased, mostly into the retail sectors, and that's where the labor market is also shaping. The way the more and more technological access into the product market, the getting more and more entrenched, so it is also have the implications on the labor market too, because labor is also one factor of production that we discussed in the economics 101. So labor is also one of the component in which they externalizes all the risk and the losses onto the worker. So let's understand, okay, how they actually work. So this year the ILO is celebrating the future of work, and they are really worried about what will happen to the future of work, especially after the pandemic, where the labor market has seen to be a less resilience to grapple with this problem. Because as you know, at the time of pandemic, labor, especially the platform workers, were seen as a person who will actually spread the like a COVID. So he was traumatized, victimized, and also so much kind of a phobia has been labored upon them. But also on the same time, the government of India was making them an essential service worker also. So this kind of a dilemma where the workers are actually finding for their own presence, where they will be located in the larger, the digital economic framework. What is the identity of a worker? Where he actually stand? Will it be stand or will she be stand as an independent contractor, business partner, contingent worker, or we will be called as a cogs in the wheel, so like a gig workers? So this is the larger question that we would like to face. So the future of work, and this is an important question for the public policy that we are actually deliberating upon, that the future of work is very bleak in the sense that the future of work promises the lack of uncertainty of the workers' rights, instability in the incomes, lack of social cohesion, deprivations. So at the one hand, the Indian GDP is actually growing, and you must have seen yesterday's economic times. The GDP figures are actually moving ahead. The unemployment rate actually falling down slightly as compared to the previous year. But on the second hand, we are also seeing the government of India is actually providing the free food. It's not a freebie, it's a food subsidy and the food entitlements for the poor. It means that somewhere the technological progress and the GDP advancement are actually happening at the cost of a someone. And who is this someone? These are the workers who are actually driving the India's economy. So digitally mediated platform, this is the new and emerging areas where I would like the young scholars to actually go and get into engage with some of the fundamental questions, okay, how these technologically mediated platforms are actually altering the typical employer-employee relationship, and what are these implications, as Anupam has pointed out, that when you configure the factory system or the workplace system, it has a larger implications for the society. So these implications is not for the political reasons, but these implications to bring social harmony within the society also. So we call it as a shared prosperity. So as the civilization moves, as the industrialization moves, society maturely grows, and then the wealth is shared between all the countries. So that's what we have learned from the welfare capitalisms or maybe welfare states in the European Unions, how the society has progressed gradually. So the digital platform economy, this is the puzzle number one, bring us to the old questions that are they really ensuring us the time wages? It means you work from the 9 to 5 and you get the wages including the entitlement, or are they really assuring us the peace wages? It means the more you work, the more you get, the less you work, the less you get. So the productivity linked wages, that is where. Nobody will say that, okay, the productivity linked wages are really good, because in the previous speakers, the previous sessions talks about that. In economics, we talked about the marginal productivity and the marginal cost, where it has to link with somewhere with the performances. But is it really true with the case of a labor? I can think about land labor, land capital technology, entrepreneurship. But labor is the quasi-fixed factor of production. You can simply hire him, but it is difficult to fire him. That's where the comes, because it also entails about the constitution's law, rights, and also other frameworks in which the labor as a human is being helping us to for the production processes. This process, moving from the time wage to the piece wage, is actually moving towards disposition from the entitlements. We are disposing the workers from the entitlement. And hence, these are actually is a mere tokenisms to allure the workers to get into the industry, and then we use is labor productivity to exploit more and more labor. As you must have seen in 2013 when the Uber actually launched, they were actually burning the cash. 80% of their seed grants were actually burned as a cash to give more and more incentives. And that point of a time, they used to charge 4 to 6% as their commission. But in today's context, I checked last week, so it is now 33% of the total commission. So if they will earn 100 bucks, 33 rupees will go to the pockets of the Uber, because they are actually providing the contract. And these are the one, it makes making them a more and more vulnerable. And why the law is not actually getting into to protect the worker of, to the interest of this worker? For the two reasons. One, Indian economy has never seen the larger shocks. Pandemic gave the larger shocks, and one of the area in which the larger shock helps the existing legal system to revive is the labor legislations. And that's why all the labor laws were diluted at the time when the pandemic was actually going through. The second area in which the external shocks really made the way is that lack of clarity about how the digital economy should be regularized. So that's the second area in which where we don't have the governance model in which that we can actually regulate the labor economy. So I just wanted to give you the frictions where the public policy areas can actually come in. If you see the left side, the traditional economy, where the employer-employee relationships, and you can see the overlapping circles. These overlapping circles where the regulation framework will come, and the state as an anchoring point will strike the balance between the employer who brings the capital and the labor who brings the labor productivity and the labor services. So that's where they will strike the balance, and it will ensure the harmonious industrialization. But with the advent of digital economy, or mostly, when we started to give leeway to the labor laws, the power of a state has actually started crumbling, and you will see the forces are actually coming from both the sides. Where the platform wanted to forcefully minimize the role of the government, that's what we call the minimum government and the maximum governments. So you shrink the role of a government. And secondly, the worker is trying to find out the way where they can actually restore the social dialogue between the state and the employer. And that's where these two are the contesting points that are happening. So many trade unions and the laborers are actually contesting because of that. The space where they used to have negotiation has actually failed miserably over the last 20 years. Last Indian Labour Conference, which is the highest body where the employer-employee actually come and discuss, and they discussed about the problem, has held prior to 2014. After that, no ILC has happened in India. Now, why the state is actually withering away? The dilemma for the state is that they have turned the blind eye towards the regulations. So we call the de facto regulations, where the law has actually been implemented, not the law that looks very nice in the black letters law. The second areas where the strategy went wrong, the prescription to the labor reform went wrong, is the linking the labor market with the product market. So labor market has started responding to the need of the product markets, and that's where the things actually went wrong. In the sense that as the product conditions or the market condition will change, employer will fire or hire. We call it the adjustment cost. The adjustment cost becomes the main parametrics or main metrics in which the performance of the platform will be evaluated based upon that, how sensible and responsible they are with the cost. Second, the role of embedded technology. The technology is not only providing jobs to the company, to the platform workers. Technology also providing surveillance, they're monitoring their performances, and secondly, they are linking not only the consumption aspect but also from where they're actually taking the trading. So these are the interlinked technologies are not able to, the state is not able to figure it out how to control these embedded tech platforms where the state has a very limited knowledge and very limited engagements, and that's how the labor market has actually gone completely, like a fettered way where they are not able to control it. And the last one, why the state is reluctant. The case the Ms. Navika ji actually asked, why we are actually having this inward approach to the policy. The state is reluctant to deal with the capital. When I'm using the word reluctant, in the sense we are being afraid that the capital might fly away from the India. And that's why the state is not actually encouraging the shared prosperity interest. Rather, they are protecting the interest of the capital, because the reluctancy comes because we are afraid that the capital might flight away from India, and that's where. But we are not actually tapping the potentials that we have. Despite having the unbalanced economic structure, because we moved, the transition of the Indian economy has gone from the agriculture to the service. The industrialization phase we had only for the 3 decades. We never had that much larger period of the industrialization. And that's where we are not able to accommodate unlimited supply of labor who are migrating from the rural areas to the urban area, and they are getting into the job. So 4 kind of problems that we are actually saying. First, this kind of allied areas where we are creating the situations where workers are being misclassified, and since you misclassified worker, lack of entitlement, so they are at the risk of despotism on demand. So the technology controls their work, and who controls the technology? It's the company, they are actually there. Then risk-seeking behavior, employee workers are engaged into the risk-seeking behavior because they wanted to earn more money so that they can actually have a decent life. So a risk-seeking behavior is actually getting into that. It's turned out to be a negative sum game. So I'll just quickly run. So already the steps in which how their institutionalized precarity has already been said by the Professor Jha. So first, it's about a good guesses in which you burn the cash, you attract the more customers, you retain and you outperform the existing players, and then you try to monopolize that market share, and then you lease the company so that the companies can be raise the funds from the capital market. In this case, at each stage, the risk has been exposed or externalized on the worker, because only the workers can actually willing to work at the lower wages. Why they are actually willing to work at the lower wages? Because there are no outside employment to employee relationship action. So who are these workers? Informal gigs and platform. So the company says that we are bringing flexibility to the Indian economy. Yes, flexibility they are bringing. People can work when they want, people can leave when they want. But this flexibility is not for the worker. This flexibility is for the tech companies, where they can decide how much workers they want, they can decide how much order they can give, they can decide how much wages they can pay, and they are price sensitive to the customer. So it is the customer's preferences who decides the internal reconfiguration of the company's cost, and then whatever is left out, the residual amount is being externalized onto the worker. At the end of the day, workers barely earn 500 to 600 rupees in a day. And this is not me. Even if you are actually taking any cab, just ask driver informally how much, and you ask him to just show the app and just see his commissions. So you will come to know on that. So what are the policy challenges? I have wrote down the 4 policy challenges. These are emerging and still we are very contesting. Recognizing who are the workers, and then there are 3 landmark judgments from the Supreme Courts. Legal jurisprudence, are these workers, if we accept the definitions, can we really invoke ILO's fundamental principles and right to work conventions? And then Industrial Dispute and Industrial Relation Act. This is a historicization of the labor regulations, which is an area in which public policy scholars can come. How at the different contexts the public policy has shaped. not only through the bureaucracy, but also we call it the cross-fading effect. Now, the Labour Ministry's agenda has not been decided by the Labour Ministry, but it has been decided by the FICCI and the Ministry of Company Affairs. So as you can see how the other ministries, not only about the executive and the bureaucracy, but it's also about the different institutions that shaping the face of a public policy. That is another area in which how the external forces can change the face of a public. So as you can see, the employment is going down, GDP is going up. So what are the road that we have less travels? And then I will just highlight, by the 2030, we will have almost like 23.8 million gig workers or the platform workers, and there actually the presence will going. So these are the policy challenges. One, the regulations. Which regulation should we bring tech-driven regulation or should we bring labor-driven regulation? That's the one thing. Second, compliances. Should we make self-compliances as a norms where the company can self-comply, or should we bring compliances through the bureaucracy? That's the another area. Yeah. The tech oversight, like who should be controlling the tech? Like lot of facial recognition technologies and also productivity monitoring technology. What should be the modus operandi of this tech, which are actually controlling the future of a work and the present time of the work also. And then last and most important thing, where here we have gone little bit of lawlessness. So the role of a state in terms of the government. What would be the role of a state in the digital economy? With this note, I would like to stop here and I would like to take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sapkal. As he has rightly identified that there are new challenges that are emerging for labor in the digital economy. If you are recognized as labor and not recognized as labor, even if you are recognized as labor, we have seen that after pandemic there's work from home, and most of the public policies that we had, very strong public policy for the labor protection, has become ineffective. Just to give you an idea, the sexual harassment, prevention of sexual harassment policy says that if any unwanted things that are said to you in your workplace, that is, kind of punishable. But if it is said to you if you're working from home, there's no policy on that, there's no clarity on that. So a lot of nuances are emerging which are supposed to be looked into. We started 5 minutes late, so I'm assuming that we have 5 minutes more to conclude. Can we have quick 2 or 3 questions? Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone. I have just 2 points to make. Thanks, Professor Shishir, for the meeting.
Can you please keep it very quick?
Yeah. First of all, Professor Rahul. So you discussed about lack of entitlement in the gig economy for the laborers, and then you compare at the cost of public distribution system and free meals. These are 2 different policy aspects, and they do not combine together. I think that's one aspect that you have to look for research. And Dr. Anupam Guha, so your part was interesting, but then when you classify the workers in a gig economy, the unpaid laborers, users who are generating data all the time across the globe, that's something which we not discuss. We skip that part. That's something Fair Work at the Oxford Institute they are looking into, and that's something that needs to be taken care of.
Yeah, let's take 2 more questions and then we can answer.
Okay.
To him.
Digital economy is also leading to digital politics in the sense that elections are being fought by WhatsApp and Facebook. That is one. And when you are talking about retreat of the state is at international level where there are United Nations, SAARC, regional groupings, and at national level where it is central government, and at federal level where it is a state government, and at local level where we have municipalities. So this retreat of the state will help whom? Will it help the people or the capitalists, or it will help all of them? If this retreat of the state can help all stakeholders, then it will be a good idea.
Okay, that's more of an observation. Yes, one last question. I think we could.
Thank you, panelists. My question is to Professor Jha. You spoke about VCs being agnostic to ethical and moral concerns and you took the example of Theranos, even with what's happened with FTX. What do you think we could do in terms of ensuring that, since VCs have the power to influence a lot of practices that are going to happen. What can we do to ensure that they keep ethics and moral in place while they influence those practices today? Because with the boom of startups, this risk would be run. If it's happening in the US, I don't see why India wouldn't face it.
Yeah, thank you. So can we have 1 minute each for all of you? Professor.
Yeah, I appreciate Tariq's questions. Yeah, I will just give you, okay, under Article 21 and Directive Principles, every citizens are entitled to right to work as well as right to livelihood and then all the social benefit. When I use the word called how the digital or platforms are institutionalized in precarity. There is one reason, because if you don't consider them as a worker, so then they are not entitled for the social security and other legal entitlement. As a result of that, it impacts on their livelihood and income. So as the income decreases, then they become more and more poorer because of the double burden that actually been exposed because of they have actually buying the trade, and then become they poor. Then the state provides from the other hand freebies, the so-called freebies, the welfare entitlement, give them a more and more ration. So my argument is simple: instead of giving them like a too much like a free subsidy on the food, make them legally more empowered so that they don't have to go through that line and they can earn their more livelihood. And this is the way that we have seen. Like we did the survey during the COVID, and there are 3 rounds which is available online also. There Ola and Uber drivers, literally they have to stand in the PDA shop to get all the subsidized food. 2 rupees rice, 1 rupee, 3 rupees, all the subsidized food. The reason is that we are making the labor market more and more susceptible and the vulnerable because there are no laws that protect the interest of the worker. And that's why these are not two things, they are interlinked. They are overlapping with each other.
Yeah, Professor Anupam.
So that was a very good question because it allows me to rant on a thing on which my talk was not on, but which I like to rant about anyway, right? So there are 2 kinds of hidden or invisibilized labor that is happening behind the machine learning ecosystem. One is the production of data, which you correctly observed is often by people who are not even aware that their data has value. So users of social media, users of platforms, constantly generating data, creating free intelligence for these companies. This would require a data governance platform which takes into account that individual and community generated data has a value of its own. Unfortunately, the 2 dominant models that we have the American model, which is ignore this is not happening, don't look closely at data, let free ka paisa aa raha hai aane do. The other model is what India is pushing for, the fiduciary model. And even the fiduciary model is not good because the fiduciary model basically says, trust the state to appoint a private company to look over your data's commercial interests. They will collect all the data and use it in the best possible manner. You don't worry about it. Both these models essentially tell the citizen and the community from where the data is coming is that you don't have any agency over the data you produce basically. And that is a problem. Now there are 2-3 more models which more or less are European in origin, which sort of look at data as a commons of sort, which I find very interesting. I find that better than the fiduciary model, and it is vital that these debates happen on the nature of data. That is the first thing. The second place of hidden labor is what is called ghost work. You have these entire economies of very ill-paid work which go behind systems like, for example, moderation of YouTube and social media comments. So the narrative is that machine learning is moderating hate speech on YouTube. Reality is machine learning is really bad at it. At the end of the day, you need human moderators, but those human moderators are remarkably ill-paid, generally in the global south, and are exposed to so much racism, sexism, casteism, whatever in one day that a lot of them suffer from mental health issues. So there is a whole grey economy of data curation which is ill-regulated or unregulated, which also needs policy intervention. Another big example is Mechanical Turk, where you can get really useful data at the cost of pennies by paying some guy in Philippines to click on your data sets things. And every machine learning researcher has indulged in Mechanical Turk, so there is that. So these are the two kinds of areas which require policy interventions and research and shining some empirical light on, and people need to work on that.
Yeah, thank you.
A short answer to your question, nothing succeeds like it seems. We see success. Right? I mean, it's almost like a Wild West. Right? Many of them have done very well. I don't want to take away from that. But it's amazing, right? The deep influence. Right? It was one marginal industry in one corner affecting certain, but it's like, almost the entire human, if you want to say, the human planet, right, is going to be affected by the digital sort of digitization process. So in that way, I think we need to be much more careful, meticulous about what really is happening in terms of, right, so there has to be a particular kinds of regulation. Now, one kind of regulation across the board will not work. It perhaps has to be sector driven, right? But I think we need to wake up and, sort of understand that this is quite bizarre, right? I mean, WeWork's got $10 billion, of loan, $10 billion, right? And well, anyway, I don't want to go on, but it's interesting. I think we need to do some more due diligence on the part of governance about what's happening. That's what my short answer is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for attending this session. Our time is up, and I hope, thanks to ISB Hyderabad as well for this conference. I hope the discussion will help in coming with some good recommendations for public policy on this. Thank you.